Well, this is Head to Head, and I'm Vivica Williams. Matthew Schmidt is a professor at University of New Haven, a Russia expert, and he also served as an OSCE monitor during the 2014 elections here in Ukraine. And today we're going to be talking about geopolitics. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
So first, I want to start off, I didn't list everything you've been involved in, that's way too long. So you've also been involved with training and with the military.
So I was a professor at the Command and General Staff College, actually at what's called their School of Advanced Military Studies, where I trained U.S. military planners at the operational and at the strategic level, including also our international partners from the United Kingdom, from Australia, from Germany, Poland, and other NATO countries.
So then you're able to give us a really good insight on what's going on with NATO and with Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah, so the issue with NATO and Ukraine is that Russia has been increasing its pressure since 2013, 2014 on NATO countries, particularly in places like the Baltics and Estonia, obviously here in Ukraine, in places like Georgia, in South Ossetia, with flyovers in the Black Sea, this kind of thing. And on the one hand, this has been useful for NATO because it has reinvigorated its reason for being. On the other hand, it has obviously increased tensions between NATO and Russia as NATO has deployed more and more troops to these areas. Now, I say more and more, it's still very small numbers, and these troops that are deployed are essentially tripwire troops. They would never be enough to withstand a full Russian assault, but everybody understands that that's not the way the game is played. So a lot of this is for show, and the last thing I would really emphasize for your viewers in terms of what's going on with NATO is that the new Trump administration has really been sending a variety of mixed messages.
Right, right.
So if I may continue on that theme, right? What's happened in the campaign is that candidate Trump flat out said that he thought NATO was obsolete. This, of course, caused leaders in NATO countries to perk up and to question what it was they were doing. He has continued to push that line, and he's backed off a little bit. But from someone in my position, a professional in foreign policy, the fear is that eventually over time, a place like Poland, for instance, looks out and says, how much can I trust that NATO umbrella, that the United States security umbrella that has allowed me to build up my society to economically, right, socially and politically, right, to avoid having to overspend to protect myself against the larger neighbor to the east, how long is that going to last?
And I think German Chancellor Angela Merkel brought this up, that it makes it hard to trust Trump at this point. And do you see that these troops, you're saying these troops that are been sent to the Baltics, to Poland, they're not for, are they showing that there's enough support?
So the troops are there for political reasons. It's like sending a ship into port, except we send 1,000 paratroopers over to Estonia, and we do some exercises, and people take pictures and video, and they say, look, the United States is there, and they're training Estonian paratroopers or Polish paratroopers or with the Germans or whatever. But 1,000 troops would never stop a Russian assault. The idea there is to reinforce our political commitment.
Right. And so what about the pushback from Russia? We see that Russia's actually doing some flyovers, this military push to see where, how far the U.S. or NATO is going to respond.
So, right. So what Russia is doing is they are pushing back on U.S. forces. They're trying to see about triggering incidents and things like that, that essentially will force NATO countries to deal with the question of whether or not they're going to increase their military support for each other. And Putin is counting on the fact that that won't happen. And then if it doesn't happen, then the countries that are on the front line, like Estonia and Ukraine and Poland, will say, well, if we can't count on NATO support, right, then we have to do something ourselves. And if for a country like Poland or like Germany, it might mean increasing their armed forces, which is detrimental in other ways, and slowly sort of taking on an independent foreign policy separate from NATO. For a country like Ukraine, who's at war with Russia, right, it brings up the question of whether or not it could ever trust becoming a NATO partner, or that even if it did, that NATO would back it up.
Right, and we look, when you're bringing that up, we look at the Budapest Memorandum, right? So there's already this belief that there's not going to be this support in that side.
Right, and I mean, to be quite frank about it, the political logic of the United States supporting Ukraine is very thin. It's highly unlikely that that will happen in any kind of overt way. We would never send our troops in to help back up Ukrainian troops and take back lost territory and things like that. The flip side of this is what we're doing when we pass bills in Congress to say, well, we'll let you have quote, defensive weapons and other, military supplies, medical supplies, and things like that. And what, of course, also happens is that our CIA and other groups work to make sure that weapon supplies that we can sell to states like Turkey somehow end up in the hands of forces that we want to support here and in Syria and other places. And so these are the games that are played on the international level. So
do you see then that maybe Trump is playing to public opinion, but on the opposite, we see a lot of backdoor kind of deals, if it's what you're saying here, that are kind of the opposite of this? Well, the deals that I'm mentioning, the arm deals and the supply deals, these things were in place before Trump became president. So it's what's happening is these deals are continuing, but they're not being initiated by Trump, and the question is would he shut them down under Russian pressure, depending on his connections to the Kremlin or not? And we don't know the answer yet to these kinds of things. But definitely what Trump is doing is on the one hand signaling that he would be willing to support some kind of brokered peace, between Russia and Ukraine, which goes against the Budapest Agreement, which goes against the expectation of the Ukrainian people under the Obama administration, would be a change in American foreign policy, and at the same time is still allowing these other activities to happen, largely because they're out of the public eye. And you were talking here about, let's talk about Trump and his connections to Russia. So this could take us to the James Comey testimony. And do you think, based on what's coming out, that that Trump is really committed to the sanctions on Russia? He could be, but not for the reasons because he thinks Russia deserves them. He could be well committed to the sanctions because he needs to be for his political sake, because he has to do it in order to save his political, empire, to protect his power and his seat. I think that the issue with Donald Trump and Russia, frankly, goes back to the 1990s. I think it goes back to the outflow of billions of dollars, something like $25 billion a year, if I remember correctly, was leaving the former Soviet Union. And a lot of that money ended up at certain New York banks, which was then reinvested, as was wont at the time, into two basic industries, which were real estate and casinos, because it allowed the money to be laundered rather easily. And I simply throw up and say, a guy who was a real estate magnate and owned casinos in Atlantic City, what are the chances that some large chunk of that money did not end up in his various businesses? So that doesn't mean that Trump knew whose money it was. It doesn't mean that there was collusion. But it does mean that that's the obvious point in time in which he starts to rely upon investors, state or otherwise, from the former Soviet Union. Well, and Trump and his cohorts, particularly Tillerson, are first and foremost businessmen. And, absolutely. Yeah, and so we're looking back at this idea of not releasing tax returns, of looking at what are Trump's and their desires from Russia. We're looking at the business part. Do you see this as an interference or creating a first and foremost for them on a U.S. policy and using their positions to further their own gains? I think that's the interesting question of what's going on, is why. If you go back to the 90s and you say that the Trump organization was reliant on Russian money, former Soviet money, to pull itself out of bankruptcy in that period between 92 and 95, which was that intense period when this money was being expropriated from former Soviet states, And then you think to yourself that Trump's interest then was simply in getting out of his own financial problems, And you say that the potential Russian investors, perhaps Putin and his Ozero collective, is investing in this point too, doesn't know who Trump is, doesn't care, But it's a connection. And the way that Russian security services work is that they make many connections and they make many investments. They work like venture capitalists, and they say, well, we'll put some money over here, put some money over here. We'll pick up this person and that person and the other person. And 9 of 10 of those people never materialize as anyone that they can use for purposes of state later. But I think it just turns out that Donald Trump, in essence, got lucky with his TV career and then with his sudden political career, and ends up, in the White House, and a person that can be used
in this way. Right? And so now I think the question is what does Russia want with that? What does Putin want with Donald Trump? I think there are broad answers to this. There's nothing specific.
Right. And when we look at Trump's Twitter, I mean, I think it was said some years ago that perhaps he has this phrase, was it diarrhea of the mouth and constipation of the brain? So do you think this comes from, it shows that perhaps unwittingly or unwittingly that Trump can be used by the Kremlin to pass on information? Oh,
I think absolutely. Kislyak, right, Lavrov, Putin himself, these people I think are far more clever, to say smart, right, hitri, than Trump is. And so they can use him for their ends. They understand how to manipulate his ego with flattery. And I think that's, essentially what the situation is right now. And again, I think the situation is broad, right? So the Kremlin has this idea that what it wants to do overall is to show that the United States, it doesn't exist on a higher moral plane, right? Or higher legal plane than does Russia and many other parts of the world. And so he's trying to show that corruption occurs in the United States like it does in Ukraine, like it does in Russia, which of course it does, but it doesn't in the same way. It doesn't in the same breadth and depth as it does in these places. But if you can mess up an American presidential election and leave at least reasonable doubt, right, that the outcome of the election was because of foreign interference and not actually the will of the American people, then most of the rest of the world looks around and goes, yeah, that's what happens here all the time, right? That's the way we feel when we go through our presidential elections, and it lowers America's moral standing, which lowers its effectiveness in many ways in foreign affairs, to be able to say, you know what, Russia, you need these sanctions on you because of the things that you do. When people will turn around now, Russia will say, well, why don't we sanction the United States? Because we're doing X, Y, or Z in Syria or other places.
And this is definitely a type of mechanism of casting doubt, creating doubt. And talking about this, let's turn back to how the U.S. military is adapting to the inconsistencies in Trump's message regarding NATO and regarding Russia.
So the military, if you look at the NATO commander, if you look at the U.S. commander in Europe, right, they will say publicly and privately that they need to support NATO, right, and that is the U.S. position. Other people from the administration, Trump himself, will come over and will undercut that. And then it's their job to go back in behind the scenes and try to build up NATO support. Privately, I can assure you that everybody believes that it is critical for the United States national security and for European national security to have a strong NATO.
Right.
Right? They are looking at this like they're playing the long game. They're going to figure out how they're going to use their positions, their particular bureaucratic power to strengthen NATO, right, or at least to keep it from being weakened by a president who is only going to be in office temporarily, either 4 or 8 years, but not more than that. And they are looking long term here. So they're trying to play this game where they do technically what the boss tells them to do, while at the same time, not interfering with the legacy of this institution that they believe in.
And speaking of long-term games, let's switch back to Ukraine. What do you think Putin's long-term game is in Ukraine?
A lot of people think that Vladimir Putin is what we say in my field, a realist, that he's calculating. So when things started here, people said, well, Putin wants Ukraine because he wants their oil and gas. Or he wants Ukraine because, my favorite was, he wants Ukraine because he wants Crimea. It's strategically important. And I always said, why does he want Crimea? He has Novorossiysk. Right? And the truth of the matter is the Black Sea is a giant lake. And if there was a shooting war, our planes would take off from Turkey, his planes would take off from Novorossiysk, and everything floating on the water would be dead in 15 minutes. Right? Why does he want Crimea? Symbolism. Right. Why does he want Ukraine? Because he is a Eurasianist. Right. Because he understands, and this is what Americans don't get, he understands that Ukraine is sacred ground. And that if Ukraine looks west and grows into a European country with European values on issues like human rights and gay rights, right? And if its economy gets connected with the West, and its university students are connected with the West and do exchanges, and it builds in that direction, that he has a much weaker Russia, right? Because there is no Russia without Ukraine, or no Soviet Union without Ukraine, as the phrase went. And then the other thing is that should the revolution of dignity succeed in producing a more vibrant, right, democratic Ukraine over time, the intelligentsia here will be the root of the intelligentsia that will undo Putin's system of government in the future. And that's what he wants. And the Donbass region is under his control as a kind of thermostat, right? It's a frozen or a slushy kind of conflict. And what he does there is cranks up the violence when he needs to do it in order to destabilize the government here in Kiev, to try to bring it down and put in place not someone who will make Ukraine part of Russia, but someone who will turn Ukraine eastward instead of westward. Right? And he dials it down when international pressure gets too high, and he says, I don't know what you're talking about. Russian troops aren't even there. They're just, local guys.
And that's coming to that. That for me is how can the international community respond to that when it's obvious? And I've had someone say to me, well, they have to show proof. There's lots of proof for it. But when you have the president of a country saying, no, that's not the case, regardless of what you see, regardless of all the evidence, how can the international, or how should the international community be responding to this?
Well, so the international community always works on two levels, right? It works on the public level, where it doesn't want to get itself involved in complicated, dangerous matters where there are very little advantages, right? Things to be gained. So this is the U.S. position in Ukraine, right? There's not much the U.S. gets out of getting involved in the issue in Ukraine other than for moral reasons, to say it is the right thing to do. Right. But it doesn't get us money, it doesn't make us richer, it doesn't make us safer necessarily, right? And then there's the private channels, right? And in the private channels, I think you see a lot of hope. So publicly, states will say things, will tone down their willingness to do things. But privately, right, Western leaders want to defend Ukraine. They want Ukraine to succeed because they understand that it is A, right, morally right, and B, that it is in the long-term interest, right, of the rest of the world that the reforms here in Ukraine succeed, that the society grows and changes and becomes stable and more democratic. But it's difficult for them to take those words and make them public because of the nature of assigning state resources in this. And so I think it's important that people understand this. I bring students over, so I have students here right now for a class looking at the current war in Ukraine. Those kinds of efforts help bring back Americans and Canadians that understand the war here better, right? And that gets transmitted into the American population so people understand it better and they can support it. And they don't just see it as Putin versus Poroshenko. They see it as something deeper, as something coming from the society here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for these eye-opening insights for us.
My pleasure.
And today we've been talking with Matthew Schmidt, who is a professor at University of New Haven, a Russia expert, and also was here in Ukraine as an OSCE monitor for elections in 2014. Thank you for watching Head to Head. Have a wonderful day.